The silence of a climate-controlled archive is different from any other kind of quiet. It is heavy, artificial, and sterile. In the basement levels of historical societies from Richmond to Liverpool, the air is kept at a precise 18 degrees Celsius. The humidity never wavers from 50%. This is done to prevent the slow, chemical suicide of paper, to stop the acid in the fibers from eating the very history it carries. On a mahogany reading table cradled in a foam support lies a volume bound in calfskin. Its spine is cracked, the leather flaking like sunburnt skin. There are no gold-leaf titles here, no sweeping declarations of intent. It is simply a ledger. To the untrained eye, the object is an artifact of mundane bureaucracy. It is the kind of book a merchant might use to track shipments of grain or the repair of wagon wheels. The paper is heavy, handmade rag, showing the faint, horizontal lines of the wire mold used to press it. The ink is iron gall, a mixture of vitriol and oak galls that bites into the page, turning from a deep black to a rusted, sepia brown over the centuries. Everything about the physical object suggests order. It suggests a world where every action has a place, every resource has a value, and every transaction is final. The handwriting is almost universally beautiful. In the 18th and 19th centuries, penmanship was a mark of discipline and character. The clerk who maintained this specific volume, likely a plantation bookkeeper or a junior partner in a factor's firm, used a copperplate script. The capital letters are flourished with elegant loops. The descenders of the Y's and G's sweep beneath the lines with rhythmic precision. It is an aesthetic of absolute control. When the cover is turned, the internal structure reveals itself. The pages are divided into strict vertical columns. On the left, the date. In the center, the description. On the right, the denominations: pounds, shillings, and pence, or later, dollars and cents. These columns are the skeleton of the plantation system. They do not allow for nuance. They do not record the weather, the sound of the wind through the tobacco leaves, or the psychological state of the inhabitants. They record only the arithmetic of existence. In these ledgers, the names of the enslaved appear within a specific inventory. They are rarely listed alone. They exist between entries for 6 bushels of corn and 1 iron cooking pot. In the grand accounting of the Atlantic world, the human being was not a biological entity to the record keeper. They were a capital asset. To maintain the ledger was to perform a daily ritual of dehumanization, 1 ink stroke at a time. The bookkeeper's task was to ensure that the stock, the term frequently used for the enslaved population, balanced against the debts and expenditures of the estate. However, as one moves deeper into the records of the 1840s, a peculiar and chilling shift occurs in the bookkeeping. The inventory lists begin to take on a second life. A name is no longer just a mark of ownership. It becomes the header for a debt. At the top of a fresh page, the name Cato or Phoebe might appear. Beneath the name, the columns begin to fill. But these are not records of what the plantation owes the worker. The worker is owed nothing. Instead, they are records of what the worker is said to owe the plantation. The ledger creates a fiction of commerce where only one party has the power to define the terms. The researcher's finger traces a line down the page of a 1852 account book from a coastal South Carolina estate. The entries are routine. To 1 peck cornmeal. To 3 yards Osnaburg cloth. To 1 pair coarse shoes. Each item carries a price, a numerical weight that is added to the individual's name. This is the birth of the private account, a system used by masters to track the cost of maintaining their property. On paper, the enslaved person is treated as a debtor. The gravity of this system is most visible when the names transition from adults to children. In the standard inventory, a child was often recorded as a fractional hand. A 5-year-old might be listed as 1/4 hand, representing their future potential labor, rather than their current output. They were assets whose value was expected to appreciate as they grew stronger and more skilled. They were an investment in the future of the soil. But in the debt ledgers, the logic is inverted. On page 114 of a ledger from the Henrico County Archives, there is an entry for a girl named Hagar. At the time of the entry, Hagar is 6 years old. She is too small to work the heavy clay of the Virginia tobacco fields. She is too young to be tasked with the delicate, back-breaking work of the laundry. In a strictly labor-based system, Hagar would be a neutral entity, a cost of doing business perhaps, but not an active participant in the financial cycle. Yet, Hagar's name is at the top of a column. Beneath it, the ink is fresh. The bookkeeper has recorded charges against her. These are not charges for luxury or choice. They are charges for the very calories that keep her heart beating and the rough fabric that covers her skin. Every 3 months, the totals are tallied. The math is simple, cold, and relentless. The ledger reveals a terrifying reality. The child is not merely a piece of property waiting to be used. The child is being tracked as a financial liability from the moment they are capable of consuming resources. In the mind of the bookkeeper, the child is a mouth that must be paid for. As the pages turn, a pattern emerges across different estates and different decades. The dates of the entries are often the most revealing. On some pages, the charges begin long before the child has reached the age of physical maturity. The numbers begin to pile up, cents turning into dollars, pence turning into pounds. There is a silence in these numbers. It is the silence of a system that has decided, with the stroke of a pen, that a human life begins in the red. In one particular volume, the ink is slightly smeared, as if the bookkeeper were in a hurry to finish the month's end. He lists a boy named Silas. The boy is recorded as being 4 years of age. Beside his name is a balance brought forward from the previous year. The realization settles in with the weight of the calfskin cover. Silas, at 4 years old, is already carrying a financial burden. He has a balance sheet before he has a vocabulary. He is being tracked not just as a body to be sold, but as a borrower who never asked for a loan. The ledger does not explain how a 4-year-old is expected to settle an account. It simply records the deficit. It treats the child as a stagnant investment that is currently costing the firm money. As the eye moves to the very bottom of Silas's column, there is a final entry for the fiscal year. The total is carried over to the next page, to the next year, and into the boy's future. The debt is already growing. It is accruing before Silas can even hold the plow. It is a weight made of ink and paper, and it is designed to ensure that by the time he is old enough to understand the world, he will already be a man who can never be square with it. In the legal and financial architecture of the plantation, the status of a child was governed by the doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum. The condition of the child follows that of the mother. If the mother was property, the child was property. This was the foundational law of the land. But beneath the law of status lay the law of the ledger, which dictated that life was not merely inherited, it was invoiced. To understand the born Owing system, one must look at the specific line items that appear in the earliest days of an enslaved child's existence. In the account books of the expansive rice and cotton estates, the entry for a birth is not a celebration, but a calculation of net loss. The moment a child was born, they triggered a series of immediate debits that the bookkeeper meticulously assigned to their specific name, or to the family unit as a collective liability. The first charge was often the midwife's fee. Whether the midwife was a white physician brought from town or an elder enslaved woman with specialized knowledge, a value was assigned to the service of bringing the child into the world. In a Virginia ledger dated 1844, this is recorded as a flat debit of $3. The child, only hours old, has already incurred a cost that exceeds the weekly food ration of an adult field hand. This was followed by the lost labor debit. This was perhaps the most chilling application of plantation logic. When an enslaved woman went into labor and the subsequent weeks of recovery, She was absent from the fields or the big house. The bookkeeper viewed this not as a biological necessity, but as a temporary cessation of an asset's productivity. To balance this loss, the value of the labor she would have performed was frequently calculated and charged against the newborn. The infant's very entrance into the world was recorded as a theft of time from the estate. The arithmetic of infancy continued with the distribution of child cloth. In the ledgers, this appears as yards of coarse linen, flannel, or Negro cloth, a low-grade, abrasive textile manufactured specifically for the enslaved. The cost of the thread, the needles, and the raw material was added to the child's column. While a free child might wear a hand-me-down as a matter of thrift, in the plantation ledger, every new scrap of fabric was a fresh entry in the deficit. The food rations were handled with the same cold precision. As the child moved from nursing to solid food, the peck of corn and the pound of salt pork were no longer absorbed into the mother's allotment. They were separated. By the age of 2 or 3, the child became an independent consumer on paper. In a South Carolina ledger, the bookkeeper notes, "To 1 year's subsistence for the boy Tom, $12.50. There is no evidence."
In these books of charity, the plantation was conceptualized as a closed-loop economy. Every calorie provided by the master was viewed as a loan of energy, intended to be repaid through future physical exertion. Because the child could not yet work, the interest on these calories began to compound. The ledger reflects a world where the concept of dependency was stripped of its social meaning and replaced with indebtedness. In the eyes of the record-keeper, the child was a speculative asset that was currently underperforming. To manage the risk of this underperformance, the owner used the debt as a leash. If the child were ever to seek freedom, or if a sympathetic party were to attempt to purchase them, the balance owed would be added to the market price. The debt functioned as a secondary wall of the cage. Historians examining these records often find a disturbing lack of zeroing out. In a standard business, a debt is paid and the account is closed. But for the child born into the ledger, there was no mechanism for repayment during the years of growth. The child was essentially a borrower with no income. In a document from a North Carolina tobacco plantation, the account for a child named Sarah shows a cumulative balance by the age of 5. The items are mundane: a tin cup, a small blanket, a winter coat, molasses. But the total at the bottom of the page is staggering for the era. The debt had reached a sum that would take a grown man months of overwork, labor performed beyond the required hours, to satisfy. Sarah, at 5, did not know how to read the copperplate script that defined her life. She did not know that the blanket she slept under was not a gift, but a line item. She did not know that her very existence was being tracked as a mounting failure to be profitable. The part ends with a ledger entry from 1858. The bookkeeper has finished the annual audit. He lists 6 children, all under the age of 7. Beside each name is a number representing their total cost to date. Below the list, he writes a single devastating sentence in a neat flowing hand. The above balances to be carried forward, as the subjects have yet to produce a single day's value. The realization is clear. Before these children have even learned to navigate the world, the system has ensured they are starting from a depth they can never hope to climb out of. The debt is not a mistake, it is the plan. If the birth of an enslaved child was a debit, the passage of time was an accelerator. In the world of 19th century finance, capital was never expected to sit idle. Money had to move, and where it could not move, it had to grow through the application of interest. When this logic was applied to the human beings recorded in plantation ledgers, the result was a mathematical trap from which there was no physical escape. By the time an enslaved child reached the age of 8 or 9, the ledger entries began to change. The mundane list of cloth and cornmeal remained, but a new, more predatory line item appeared: interest on balance brought forward. In many southern jurisdictions, the legal rate of interest hovered between 6% and 8%. In the private ledgers of the plantation, however, the bookkeeper was the sole arbiter of the rate. The application of interest transformed the child's debt from a static record of expenses into a living, predatory entity. Because an 8-year-old child, often referred to in records as a quarter hand, could only perform the lightest tasks, such as scaring birds from the crops or carrying water to the fields, their labor credit was negligible. On paper, the cost of their food, clothing, and the interest on their existing debt far outweighed the value of the work they performed. The ledger of a Mississippi cotton estate from 1855 provides a window into this compounding nightmare. An enslaved boy named Moses is listed. At age 9, Moses is credited with $3 for a year's work in the trash gang, the group of children and the elderly people assigned to light weeding. However, the interest on his accumulated debt from infancy alone is $4. Before Moses has even eaten a single calorie or worn a single stitch of clothing for the year, he has already fallen $1 further into the red. This was arithmetic as a form of social engineering. By ensuring the debt grew faster than the child's capacity to work, the plantation owner created a permanent moral justification for continued bondage. In the prevailing paternalistic defense of slavery, owners often claimed they could not free their dependents because the individuals were indebted to the estate for their upbringing. The ledger provided the proof for this claim. It was not a matter of skin color or law, the argument went. It was a matter of simple bookkeeping. The child simply hadn't paid their way. The bookkeepers utilized a sophisticated array of fees to ensure the columns never balanced. There were insurance premiums charged to the enslaved person's account to protect the owner against the loss of the asset should the child die or run away. There were medical fees for the administration of castor oil or the lancing of an abscess, services performed not for the child's comfort, but to protect the master's investment. Even the tools the children used were sometimes invoiced. A small hoe or a burlap sack was not provided. It was advanced against future earnings. In these volumes, one sees the transition from a system of physical discipline to one of financial enclosure. While the whip was used to enforce immediate obedience, the ledger was used to enforce a lifetime of resignation. It was a silent, bloodless violence. A child might endure a lashing and see the wounds heal, but they could not fight the ink. They could not argue with a column of numbers that grew while they slept. As the children entered their teenage years, the bookkeeping became even more cynical. The prime age was approaching, the years when their physical strength would be at its peak. In any rational system, this would be the time the debt began to decrease, but the records show the opposite. As the value of the enslaved person increased on the open market, the costs assigned to them in the private ledger often rose proportionally. Higher quality rations were charged to the account to maintain the prime condition of the worker. The debt was recalibrated to ensure it remained just out of reach of the individual's productive capacity. Historians have found instances where enslaved individuals, having learned the basics of counting, attempted to keep their own tallies of their work. These were dismissed by the bookkeepers as fraudulent or erroneous. The only record that carried the weight of law was the master's book. The ledger was a closed gate. The power of this system lay in its perceived neutrality. A ledger does not shout, it does not show anger, it simply presents a total. But that total dictated the child's reality. It determined whether they could ever hope to save enough overwork money to purchase their mother or themselves. It turned the dream of freedom into a math problem that had been rigged from the first line. Part 3 concludes with the image of a ledger from a tobacco plantation in late autumn. The bookkeeper has just finished the year-end balancing of the souls. He reaches the page for a 14-year-old girl named Celia. He adds the food, the cloth, the midwife's fee from a decade ago, and the 7 years of compounding interest. He draws a double line in red ink at the bottom of the column, the bookkeeper's symbol for a finalized total. The number at the bottom is higher than the price Celia would fetch in an auction in Charleston. The realization is cold and absolute. Celia is no longer just property. She is a bankrupt human being. Even if she worked every hour of sunlight for the rest of her life, she could never earn enough to reach zero. The debt has surpassed the value of her very life. In the cold geometry of the plantation ledger, the individual was the primary unit of debt, but the family was the safety net for the creditor. To the bookkeeper, a family was not a sentimental bond of blood and affection. It was a consolidated financial portfolio. When a child's individual debt became too heavy for their small frame to carry, or when an aging parent's productivity began to wane, the logic of the ledger did not write off the loss. Instead, it shifted the weight. The consolidated account was a common feature in the mid-19th century records of the Deep South. Here, the columns for a father, a mother, and 4 children were merged into a single family balance. This administrative move had profound consequences for the lived reality of the enslaved. It meant that the debt was contagious. A newborn's lost labor fee or an elderly grandmother's infirmary costs were placed onto the backs of the strongest members of the kin group. In a ledger from a sugar estate in Louisiana, the accounting of a family, listed simply as the group of Big Sam, illustrates this collective burden. Big Sam was a prime field hand, his labor value high, his overwork potential significant. But beneath his name, the bookkeeper has not just recorded Sam's rations, he has funneled the mounting debts of Sam's 3 young children and his ailing wife into Sam's column. Every time Sam managed to earn a few cents for extra labor performed by moonlight, the money did not go toward a future of freedom. It was instantly swallowed by the interest on the infant's subsistence, or the cost of the mother's physic. The family was managed as a single financial entity, where the surplus of the strong was perpetually used to pay the interest on the weak. This ensured that no single member of the family could ever get ahead on paper. The debt was a shared anchor. This system turned the natural instinct of family protection into a tool of management. Parents were made aware, either through direct explanation or the harsh reality of the ration line, that their children's debts were their own. If a child was lazy or unproductive in the light tasks assigned to them, the resulting deficit in the ledger was used as a justification to reduce the rations of the parents. The ledger transformed familial love into a source of leverage for the overseer. Separation, the greatest terror of the enslaved, was often framed in these books as a correction of accounts. When a family's collective debt reached a threshold where the interest exceeded the family's total labor output, the estate looked to liquidate assets to balance the books. A child would be sold not merely because a buyer was available, but because their account was in a state of permanent insolvency. The records show a chilling lack of emotion in these transactions. A bookkeeper in Georgia notes in 1859, sold the boy Peter to the estate of J. Miller. Proceeds applied to the outstanding balance of the mother, Sarah. Account now settled to date. To the man holding the pen, this was a successful audit. He had removed a non-performing asset and used the capital to clear a bad debt. To the family, it was a cataclysm. The ledger, however, had no column for the screams of the mother or the confusion of the child. It recorded only the clean result, a 0 in the right-hand column. This family balance sheet approach also meant that the debt survived death. If a father died with an outstanding balance, his debt did not disappear. It was inherited by his survivors. Children who were already born owing for their own lives found the unwashed debts of their parents added to their names. In the world of the plantation, you did not just inherit your status as a slave, you inherited the cost of your father's bread and the price of your mother's shroud. As the 1850s progressed, these ledgers became increasingly complex, tracking intergenerational liabilities that stretched back decades. The arithmetic was designed to be inescapable. By linking the deaths of the living to the deaths of the dead, and the deaths of the child to the deaths of the parent, the system created a web of obligation that the individual could never break alone. Part 4 ends with a close-up on a page from an Alabama cotton plantation dated 1860. It shows a family of 5. Each name has a small, neat D beside it, indicating debtor. At the bottom of the page, the bookkeeper has calculated the net worth of the group. He subtracts the total debt of the family from their total market value. The result is a negative number. The realization is quiet and haunting. This family, in the eyes of the law and the bank, is worth less than nothing. They are a net loss to the estate. They exist in a state of financial haunting, allowed to live and work only because the master hopes that one day the interest they produce might finally outweigh the cost of their breath. In the archives of the antebellum South, there is a conspicuous absence of school books, slates, or primers. For the enslaved child, the acquisition of knowledge was not merely a social taboo, it was a recorded financial threat. In the logic of the plantation ledger, time was the most precious commodity, and any hour spent in the pursuit of literacy was an hour of stolen labor.